Recently, skeptic Chris C.J. Cornthwaite released a video on historicity of the Book of Acts, pointing out that the book managed to get certain historical details right. Details that have been used by scholars to argue not only for the historicity of Acts, which places its author in the correct time period for what he reports, but also in the overall historical reliability of the book in regard to what it reports. CJ, however, has his doubts and instead argues that Acts is an elegant historical fiction. Now, I'm probably going to say something that is surprising, perhaps even stunning. He's right. Acts is historical fiction. What that means is something that we'll get into on the other side of the title card, so hang in there while it rolls. One of the problems with saying something is historical fiction is we can easily misunderstand the term because of our experience with it in our modern pop culture. When we think of historical fiction, some examples that might pop into our heads might be the 2000 Revolutionary War epic The Patriot, or perhaps even 2001's Pearl Harbor. Both of these movies either take actual historical events or figures and create fictional stories within those events and involve them in them. The problem is that we just can't take our modern terms or standards and read them backwards into historical works. This requires us to understand something about not only history, but about the recording of it. Hi, folks, I'm Triggerman1976, and this is the BLOGCAST. If this is your first time on the channel, please hit that like button. If you're a returning viewer and not already subscribed, then please hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you'll know when new content like this is available. Now, one of the first things that need to be understood about history is that when it comes to doing history, is that while the practice may be spoken of in scientific terms, the product that results is rarely scientific. That's not to say that those who do history are inherently dishonest or misleading, but it is to note that those who do history can sometimes be, well, subjective. Louis Gottschalk, in his primer on historiography, puts it this way: an intellectually honest writer who realizes that he is a liberal or conservative, Protestant or Catholic, American or German, white or black, middle class or proletarian, either can lean over backward against his predilections in order to achieve a greater degree of impartiality, or can inform his readers of his predilections so that they may be forewarned against them, or preferably he can do both. The writer who thinks he has no philosophy of history or who believes he is detached is self-deceived. Now, this is important because the English words history and story share a common root. It's only in the most recent sense there's been any attempt to make a distinction. After all, a newspaper story is intended to convey facts, but a fairy story is understood to be a work of fiction. To that end, we can say that history is as much about being able to tell a coherent story as it is about merely reporting bare facts. The greatest difficulty that one faces when looking at ancient history is the fact that there are often very few sources, and the sources that are available are not necessarily gathered into the most neatly compiled archives, nor do these sources often provide the details or specificity that our modern societies often demand. More importantly, the standards for historicity are largely grounded not in our particular standards, but in the standards of the culture that ultimately produced the text. This means when someone is doing the work of historiography, there are decisions that need to be made, and these decisions are often subjective and depend on someone's knowledge, not only of the subject being examined, but on their ability to handle the sources. For example, if I were to write a biography of my father's father, my grandfather, I simply do not have any immediately available information about him. Sure, I know his name, and I know a few of my experiences with him. But aside from a few pictures and a few secondhand stories about him, I don't have any sources. However, when it comes to my father, I have considerably more information due to the fact that I have his personal journals. I could just make up just about whatever I wanted to about my grandfather, and really no one could rebut or refute it. My father's a different story entirely. And how I tell their stories, that's an additional step along this path. I could simply state dull facts, or I could craft a compelling and inviting narrative about them. And telling their stories, I can paint them in a number of lights. I can paint them positively or negatively or in a neutral manner. This can be transferred to other subjects of historical inquiry. And then comes the question of the historian's own motives. Is he writing to feed the popular or approved narrative, whether positive or negative, or to actually inform the audience about the subject and then allow the audience to make their own decision? This brings us to how Acts needs to be considered. When it comes to the book of Acts, one cannot consider it apart from its companion work, the Gospel of Luke. One of the most remarkable elements from Luke's Gospel is its straightforward admission from the very beginning that it is a derivative work that's dependent upon sources. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile the narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty considering the things you have been taught. The statement that many have undertaken to compile a narrative speaks to the fact that the author of the gospel is not doing something that's original to himself, nor is he alone in this effort. The reason for the writing is also given that it is written for the purpose of giving an orderly account, as well as providing certainty concerning the things taught. The author of the gospel admits that his work is derivative. But it's also not a straightforward rehearsal of any prior material, because the author speaks the need to create an orderly account. A statement that could be taken to mean that he's producing something that's either chronological or thematic in order that the previous material somehow lacks. Acts refers backward to the gospel that precedes it, but it does something that only appears in works that are subsequent to it. While it continues the narrative set out in the gospel, it employs a number of rhetorical devices that are typical of a number of first century Greco-Roman documents, but it puts them together into a single work and then uses them to move the narrative along. If that's not enough, there appear to be two distinct manuscript streams. The Alexandrian stream that appears almost like a rough draft, and a more polished, almost commentary-like Western tradition. There's a key difference between Acts and similar works, in that Acts foregoes a formal introduction, and the Acts seems to favor brief sketches or vignettes rather than elaboration on single events. This manner of presenting content led some 19th century critical scholars to argue that Acts was a harmonization between disparate Christian groups. More importantly, scholars have begun to see Acts in terms of an apologetic, presenting Christianity as compatible with a Roman ethos and not a threat to it. The mention of miraculous acts has caused some scholars to see Acts as an early Christian novel, indeed a fiction. However, rhetorical guides have recently been discovered that allow for historical texts to engage in a degree of embellishment for dramatic purposes. Perhaps the best way to understand Acts is that it is not historiography in a pure sense. Those that are tend to engage in an intense investigation of a particular period of time or around a certain situation or around a person. Instead, Acts should be seen as that the author is acting to preserve particular stories or traditions while arranging them into a coherent and compelling narrative, while also engaging in an interpretation of events as they are being narrated. It's fair to say that the author of Acts and the Gospel, assuming they're the same person, while not a historian in the purest sense, demonstrates a deep concern for history and deserves the title of the first historian of the church, even though he does exhibit a propensity for being melodramatic at times. Acts, therefore, stands out as a unique piece of historical information that gives us insight not merely into the first decades of the church in terms of events, but it also serves to inform us of how a believer at that time interpreted those same events. Now, the question for us in this video is whether or not CJ in his video actually understands these concepts and whether or not he's being consistent.
This is an inscription from Delphi. It shows the name of somebody that we see in Acts 18, somebody named Gallio. Acts 18 says he was proconsul of Achaia. And guess what? That's what this inscription says too. For some people, this is bulletproof evidence that Acts is trustworthy. But for me, this is a smoking gun that tells me that Acts is probably historical fiction.
Now, whether or not CJ maintains this position of probability remains to be seen. But he states something that the historical accuracy of Acts is something that's been explored by scholars for the past few decades, pointing out the author of Acts demonstrates considerable knowledge about a variety of different things, from geography to sailing, including giving some of the correct titles of officials that have been confirmed by a number of archaeological discoveries, as well as the fact that he gets the chronological order of events that can be established elsewhere correct. So what's the problem? Apparently it's that Acts contradicts the Pauline epistles.
If you look at the descriptions in the book of Acts of Jerusalem and Paul's engagement with Jerusalem and the Jerusalem Council, you get something quite different than what you see in the letters of Paul, specifically in Galatians.
First of all, this allegation assumes that the accounting of the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 and Paul's statement about Peter's hypocrisy in Galatians 2 are discussing the same thing. A simple reading of the text really proves that they aren't. The only mention in Acts of Paul being in Antioch, where he could have possibly interacted with Peter in Antioch, is in Acts 11. And specific complaint by Paul about Peter in Galatians 2 has to do with Peter's and a few others' hypocritical attitudes toward table fellowship with the Greek believers there. It's not until Acts 15 that the issue of circumcision arises. The general dating of Galatians is between AD 48 and AD 57, about a 10-year window, with the general dating of the Jerusalem Council occurring no later than AD 50. This places Paul's epistle as either predating the council or written in light of it. Now, there appears to be an assumption, assuming that there was a letter, something we'll come to later, that the decision of the council, assuming it occurred as described, was immediately proliferated throughout the church, like an email blast. But if Galatians is written prior to the council, then Paul is preemptively addressing this issue based on his authority as an apostle. The answer appears to come for where you're willing to date Galatians. Now, before I get accused of nitpicking, I want to point out that I believe that CJ is glossing over events. For example,
apparently these meetings go so well that Acts has this Jerusalem council give a letter to send with Paul, basically indicating that he has been rubber stamped to preach his gospel to the Gentiles.
All right, just call it the researcher in me. It just drives for precision in representation. Here I think we need to actually quote the source in question. Then it seemed good to the apostles and the elders with the whole church to choose men from among them and send them to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. They sent Judas, called Barsabbas, and Silas, leading men among the brothers. First thing we need to note is that Paul wasn't just given a letter. The letter was sent with named men from the council. Second, this wasn't a rubber stamping of Paul to preach to the Gentiles. In fact, it's Peter who speaks in the council about his preaching to the Gentiles. Acts 15, 7-11. The decision of the council wasn't about Paul at all. Instead, it was about the Gentile believers in Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia, which, if Galatians is written contemporary with or subsequent to the council, could explain why the council's decision isn't mentioned by Paul, since the letter from the council isn't addressed to them. Paul just takes the principles articulated there and makes application. If written prior, Galatians is addressing a problem that hasn't even been addressed yet in council. And if you watch my series on the Epistle to the Romans, which I believe is dated to the mid to late 50s, one of the themes that I developed there is that Paul is still addressing the issue of the Judaizers. And this is evidenced by a number of authoritative we statements that appear in the letter. To get to the question of why Paul just doesn't quote the letter and be done with it, I would like to offer three possible solutions. One, Paul argues from deliberations rather than the conclusions. Paul does this so his readers will understand the conclusion. This provides the audience members with the reasoning and the evidence that they need to draw the conclusion instead of just a pat response. This isn't because Paul doesn't believe the council's conclusion was binding or authoritative, but that the letter, we're going to assume it exists, in his opinion, provided inadequate justification. This contributes to the fact that the men were dispatched from the council with the letter to explain it and articulate it. Now, the second reason is probably the most reasonable, being written after the fact. The second reason is probably the most reasonable. Acts is written after Galatians, Romans, and the letter it contains. Now, being written after the fact, the mention and record of the letter is done to preserve the substance of the council's deliberations. This doesn't mean that the substance of the letter hadn't penetrated or wasn't broadly accepted, as some might think. Now, there's a third option. That third option is that the letter is simply a rhetorical device common to ancient histories. This again goes back to the author's tendency to create scenes full of dramatic tension. This means that the letter is an intentional fictional creation, but it exists for the purpose of communicating in the briefest possible terms the substance and conclusions of the debate. Fictional letters were a common rhetorical tool used by ancient history writers to capture and present ideas in the most direct and apprehensible form. This doesn't mean the council didn't occur, nor does it mean there wasn't an official proclamation. But what it does do is it demonstrates the gravitas and solemnity of the event in understandable and approachable terms, which brings up another problem for CJ.
The author of Acts is creating something that we call verisimilitude. This is the appearance of truth, the appearance of history. And just for an example of this, that figure of Gamaliel putting Paul sitting at the feet of a real Jerusalem rabbi that we know about from other sources really does sound impressive. It gives Paul connections to Jerusalem. It indicates Paul's pedigree. But we only find this in Acts, and Paul never talks about this in his letters, even when it could be really helpful.
Now, if you're going to claim to be a student of history or make comments on historical documents, it would probably help to understand the terminology that's used in the production of the materials you intend to critique. The question is, in terms of historiography, what does a term like verisimilitude mean? In terms of writing history, it can best be described as a recreation of the setting and circumstances of history based on the best available evidence. What this means is when we judge the author of Acts against his contemporaries, as a historiographer, we judge both his representation of events, do they comport with what is likely to have happened as a historical event, and the manner of reporting. Does it correspond with similar methods of reporting? This is important because CJ says we can compare a primary source and a first-hand witness.
Point is, the one place where we can actually test what Acts is saying against the primary source who is apparently there and a first-hand witness, it actually falls down on about 10 different fronts.
I'm sorry, is there some other account of the Jerusalem Council that we don't know about? Again, if he's thinking about Galatians 2, that's not even about the Jerusalem Council. That's about a confrontation that occurs in Antioch, not in Jerusalem. But it also makes assumptions about the dating of Galatians that themselves aren't settled in the scholarship.
The author of Acts, I would suggest, and I'm going to show you more evidence of this in a minute, takes this one historical point, Gamaliel, takes this name and sticks the figure of Paul to it. And in doing so, creates something that we call verisimilitude. It creates the appearance of fact because it sticks this story about Paul to a real historical figure.
Okay, and if anything, the mention of Gamaliel attaches Paul to a specific, somewhat popular rabbinical school of thought, the school of Hillel. That singular mention tells a knowledgeable audience more about Paul in terms of his approach to any number of positions: philosophy, interpretation, politics, how he likes his eggs.
That's a joke, boy. You missed it.
Then a 10,000 word essay. But that has nothing to do with verisimilitude. which is about recreating historical scenes. Then he goes on to point out that several other figures are identified, and one that causes him the most consternation is the fact that Luke mentions a brief interaction with the Corinthian proconsul Gallio in Acts 18.
Gallio is proconsul of Achaia in 52 BC. Other than this inscription and Acts, would we have any way of knowing that Gallio was proconsul of Achaia? Actually, yes, we would. Gallius was born with the name Lucius Annaeus Novatus. He is a son of Seneca the Elder, and he is an older brother of Seneca the Younger, and he was actually adopted by a family friend, which is where he got the name Gallio. And not only do we know this, but we know about him from several other writings, most obviously the writings of his brother, Seneca the Younger, who dedicates several of his works to Gallio, his brother. Why does this matter? Because anybody sitting in Rome who has the ability to pop open a book, and let's say Seneca, and read it, would know a little bit about who Gallio was.
Okay, they could just as easily know who he was if they had some kind of interaction with him at some point in a specific location. Now, another point that CJ raises is that Gallio was a no-nonsense guy who we really don't know all that much about, except for the fact who he's related to and how he got his name and his character. Namely, that he wasn't inclined to put up with a lot of crap. And CJ says,
And surprise, surprise, when you look at what Acts actually tells us about Gallio, the author manages to spend 7 verses talking about the proconsul Gallio, who is no nonsense, and manages to tell us nothing that we wouldn't know already from Seneca.
well, fortunately, Paul's interaction, as described in Acts 18, 12 to 17, is fairly brief, and we can note a few things about it. Well, one of the first things that should be noted is that the author only gives us a name. And he tells us his office. And the next thing we should note is that it describes the interaction. Now, speaking from the perspective of a historian, the questions that would be asked are: 1, can we verify this person existed, that he held this office at this approximate time, and it was his interaction in or out of his ascribed character? Now, those are matters that we can gather from the available evidence.
Oh, son of a gun.
Now, those are matters we can gather from the available evidence, which includes Acts. The larger historical issue has been that the incident, as recorded, appears to fit too neatly into Luke's theological purposes. That's not a historical concern, though. For example, if the author of Acts had used his birth name, or the wrong title, or had him acting out of character, that would have immediately sent up red flags in the minds of a knowledgeable audience. But CJ's own representation of events simply doesn't cut the historical mustard. The fact that the author makes the mention of such a notable figure, in contrast to other unnamed government figures that Paul interacts with throughout Acts as a historical work, it gives it a degree of credibility, especially since Roman judges only had annual appointments to their posts, and Gallio's departure meant that Paul was likely not going to have a judge of such character again. This prompts his exit from Corinth. Now, there are very narrow conclusions that can be drawn from what is essentially a cameo appearance in the overall narrative of Acts of the Apostles, which is not the Acts of Gallio or whoever's name you want to slap in there. There is another argument that CJ has to try, though.
Steve Mason has made the case that the author of Acts knows Josephus, and I think he's right. The author of Acts has this Jewish rabbi, Gamaliel, stand up and give a speech. And the speech sounds really good, but it actually completely butchers historical information. In the speech, Gamaliel talks about 2 Jewish revolutionary figures. One is named Theudas, and then Gamaliel says after Theudas, a little while later, there came along one who was called Judas. Now, the irony is that this speech by Gamaliel gets these things totally backwards. Judas lived a long time before Gamaliel did. Theudas didn't live until 10 years after this alleged speech by Gamaliel. So the author of Acts has Rabbi Gamaliel giving a speech about this rebel who hasn't even done his rebellion yet.
Probably one of the most common arguments against the historicity of Acts is its perceived relationship to the works of Josephus, who's born around AD 37. Josephus provides us sometimes with the only key historical touch points found not only in the Gospels but also Acts. His roughly contemporary dating to the production of them, particularly Luke Acts, certainly brings into question their relationship, and when there is historical discontinuity between them, it often sets up for a competition for authority. Assuming a late date for the composition of Acts, sometime between 70 and 100 AD, definitely brings it into closer interaction with Josephus, not merely in terms of sources, but also in terms of stylistic choices, in terms of presentation. Now, when it comes to the question of their relationship, there are two questions that should be asked. What is the purpose for the composition, and who is the intended audience? These two questions appear to be avoided in these discussions, as well as questions of dating. However, there is no question that both the author of Acts and Josephus employ similar stylistic approaches to their works, firmly situating them in a popular Hellenistic style of historical writing. And with that being considered, it would be correct to say that the knife used to cut one could legitimately cut the other. And when it comes to dating the companion volumes of Luke Acts, the consensus of scholarship appears to place their dating sometime in the mid to late 70s of the first century. This dating instantly poses a problem for those who want to say that the author of those works is dependent upon Josephus, because Jewish Wars is written and published at roughly the same time and has little or no overlap with the content of Acts. Antiquities. Josephus' massive volume on the history of the Jewish people isn't completed until the end of the first century and doesn't enter into wider circulation until after his death. Perhaps that's why CJ, among others, needs Acts to be written in the second century. Is that motivated reasoning I smell? Now, if the early dating of Luke Acts holds, there's no way that the author could have known about or referred to Josephus' works unless he was literally sitting in his lap while he's writing. One of CJ's key evidences is, of course, Steve Mason's work, Josephus in the New Testament, which explores the relationship between the works of Josephus and the New Testament literature. The issue for CJ, via Mason, is when Luke uses the Hillelite successor Gamaliel to utter a key piece of historical data regarding two named Jewish rebels. CJ insists this completely butchers historical information. Now, he gets this from Mason, who claims that the actor is reversing the chronological orders of these individuals. But this assumes two things. Acts is late, thereby making it dependent on Josephus, and that Josephus is correct. Now, something scholars such as Ben Witherington have pointed out is that Josephus often contradicts himself between his works. Another point that seems to be forgotten that is in the period between 4 BC and 86, there are a number of armed revolts that occurred, and one name, Theudas, was apparently very popular during that time. And the author of Luke, via Gamaliel, could be referring to one of those. Now, that's not to say the author of Luke couldn't have been wrong, but it also doesn't mean that Josephus is correct. Historically speaking, it means that a responsible, thoughtful, and careful approach to this disparity is to hold the text in tension until another source is brought along and discovered which one can confirm one or the other. One thing that can be said for certain is that Josephus and Acts have a very complicated relationship that overlaps subjects in a way that demonstrates they are witnesses, at least to a common concern among first century Jews, or the same sources. A few months ago, I did a compressed review on the book Misusing Scripture, which was an edited volume penned by a number of liberal and skeptical Biblical Scholars, which critiqued how conservative believing scholars and apologists tend to handle the biblical text or the sources related to them. And one thing I discovered is that many of these essays suffered from outdated opinions and often had to engage in misrepresentation of the sources or those they were critiquing. That's not to say that some of their criticisms were illegitimate or uncalled for, but sometimes personal animus can drive a criticism more than the evidence or the actual arguments. CJ's video presents much like many of those chapters in Misusing Scripture. They look good at a distance, but like a stuccoed house, the closer you get, the more imperfections you see. In truth, he's speaking largely to an audience who most likely doesn't understand the subject and the various styles of ancient historiography or the rhetorical styles and practices that an author might employ to communicate. He also seems ignorant of how one does history in the first place and how to analyze sources or how to relate sources to one another. He either doesn't understand the process of narrativizing history or he doesn't understand how history is done in the first place. Now, I'm not an expert and I'm not claiming to be, but I can pick up a book and I can read it. And some of the books I've happened to pick up over the years are books on doing historiography and the process behind it, especially ancient historiography. Not just the works, but also about the styles and methods employed to do it. This is a problem I've discussed elsewhere, and it just seems to keep cropping up. I expect it from non specialists, but when it comes to those who have allegedly degrees in a subject that have demonstrated an ability to do research, it's pretty disappointing and makes me wonder exactly who's giving out these degrees. Now, I begin this by affirming something that might be controversial, that the book of Acts is historical fiction. And I can say that because all historiographical books are technically fiction. But being fiction doesn't mean that they're false. This is because the retelling of history is subjective and often very selective. It doesn't mean that the events didn't happen or that every history book is wrong. What it means is that whenever you attempt to narrate events, to attempt to put them in order, to explain relationships, or even to attempt to find the meaning behind events, there's choices that have to be made. Facts might get reframed, words might be forgotten. Events are interpreted in light of assumptions. As a result, events can be interpreted rightly or they can be interpreted wrongly. And we tend to forget that there is such a thing as doing bad history. For example, the 1619 Project. In our modern era, we tend to take things like audio and video recording for granted and seem to forget that the vast majority of human history was either communicated by word of mouth or scratched onto a cave wall in a pictogram or is just simply lost. Sometimes it's found in the diaries or letters of those who've gone before us, and those remembrances can be colored by factors that we're ignorant of. The frightening thing is that even with video and audio recordings, people can interpret what is on the screen or what is being played through the speakers in wildly different ways, often depending on their political predilections. Chief examples include the arrest of George Floyd, and more recently, the shootings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy by federal law enforcement officers. The inherent problem with arguments like CJ's is that it is remarkably inconsistent. The blade he uses has two edges and it cuts both ways. This is seen by his dependence on Josephus, who is incredibly inconsistent and has his own errors that one needs to reconcile. As someone once said,
the inconsistency is the sign of a failed argument.
The book of Acts is historical fiction, just like Josephus, or Thucydides, or Xenophon. But their being fiction doesn't mean that they're fictional. Every historical record is marked with rhetorical devices and imaginings because history is narrated. It's filtered to us in an incomplete, imprecise, and sometimes biased manner, evidenced by the saying, history is written by the victors. Well, that's all for this episode of the BLOGCAST. If you enjoyed it, please be sure and hit that like button. If you found it interesting, then please share it with your friends. And if you aren't already subscribed, then please be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell so you'll know when new content is available. Don't forget to follow me on X and Instagram at Triggerman1976, links to which are in the link tree in the description, where you'll also find links to my blogs as well as my affiliate store, Well, you'll find many of the resources I use, like Kenneth Bailey's Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes. Purchases from the store help me to continue to produce content and help you with great deals. Again, I'm Sugarman1976. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, friends, God bless.